The planet's puppet masters almost surely have a plan. There's clearly maybe something there beyond the realm of man. And until you've thoroughly tested every last close-justed view, I find the more you think you know, the less you really do.
That's true, Dr. Zayas. Very well.
Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Yeah, where would we be without THC? The Higher Side Chat Show, Greg Carlwood and Company.
Hello again, Higher Side Chatters. Hope you're doing well, drinking just a little drink and smoking quite a large amount of smoke, enjoying a nice 70-degree December day here in sunny San Diego. I'm Greg Carlwood, trying to stay positive in a mad world that seems quite determined to break me of that habit. I'm sure many of us know the feeling all too well, but we do what we can. Anyway, thanks for listening. Today we got James Alfred back along with Crrow, and we're going to hear about the latest sections of the dense Hadibov material James has broken down and some other interesting things he's been researching. If you're fairly new to THC, you really should try to go through the Crrow shows we've had up until this point, or at least the first show with James Alfred. I'll try to remember to add the links to the show notes because this really is a part 2 or maybe even a part 5 or 6, depending on how you want to count it. But I really enjoy the Hadibov work. I tend to always enjoy things that are getting nearly no attention, things that aren't on everybody's radar. A good example of the opposite is Snowden. I don't take anything the guy says seriously. Real whistleblowers don't live as long as he has, don't get mainstream news coverage, and don't become household names in a system that likes its secrets. It's a bit of a joke, but that is why I like the Hadibov stuff. It's just the opposite. Almost nobody's talking about it. And worse still, as it gains attention, more and more files have been removed from the online archives they were originally found in. To me, it's a bit like the shaver mystery. You can see parallels in a guy working underground and uncovering something odd and pulling the thread more and more until he discovers a huge can of worms nobody was supposed to know about. It's also a bit like Tesla's story. There are some elements there. A brilliant guy doing very mathematic and scientific analysis of under-the-radar elements of our environment, and after his death, his research was taken by agents of the shadowy elite. It jives with Gnostic stories. It fits with the self-activating hardware Linda Moulton Howe is talking about, and it even has the ancient aliens Anunnaki paradigms covered. So to me, this is a real sweet spot, and more people are getting Hadibov fever, as you'll hear, but I just wanted to give a little context to people who might be jumping into the middle of a pretty long saga, maybe the only series I've gotten the show involved in. And before we really get serious, I also did get a message from November's Money Bomb winner, taking home $343. Very nice. Thanks to all the listeners who keep that going. I'm happy to do it, and when I lived in Missouri, that was a month's rent almost. And I am happy to be one of the only shows that has really tried to give back in a big way, and it can be done. I don't know how long we're going to keep doing it, but I think it's a beautiful thing. So hearing from him will just take a minute. And guys, with that, it's time to pack your glass and park your ass, because we're laying down another chapter in the Hadibov saga involving control systems, the lunar wave, genetic engineering, secret history, transhumanism, magic, alien entities, and more, with the legendary Crrow and the majestic James Alfred on the other side.
You have one new message.
Hey Greg, this is Danny from Oregon, and I'm your Money Bomb winner. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the work that you do with THC. My favorite episodes are Crrow777. That's how I learned about you. The most influential episode, though, is Care of St. Louis. I realized that in addition to shuffling from room to room at the sound of a bell, that I was giving my authority away, the authorship of my perceptions away at the sound of a bell. And in waking up and learning about 9/11 and GC math and the cancer industry and all these other things was just to reclaim my authority and give it away to somebody else. And I knew right then and there I had to author my own perceptions. And I didn't know how to do that. And that scared the shit out of me. So a couple months of soul searching, and just a couple days ago, I just hit on the answer for myself. And I am so excited. And I've shared it with a few people, and they've been blown away. So what I'm going to do with this Money Bomb winning is upgrade my equipment. I have a YouTube channel. It's called Lunacy, Lunasee. That's 2 words. And I'm going to get my ideas out there. And I'm also filming the moon to try to confirm the lunar wave, Crrow777's observations. The suggestion for a future episode is the Kesh Foundation and Dr. Kesh. In October of 2015, they gave away blueprints to the world for a free energy generator, and I'd love to learn more. Thanks again, Greg. Bye-bye.
It's the Higher Side Chats podcast, but you can call it THC. Always talking fringe ideas, digging up conspiracies. Stuff they don't want you to know, it's the stuff we want to see. That's life here on the higher side. It's the place for me, it's my favorite show, where the guests are great and my mind gets blown. The higher side, love the higher side. Raise your glass and toast to Carlwood, the host, on the Higher Side Chat Show. That's life here on the Higher Side Chat.
All right, people, we are getting weirder than weird today. Most of you know by now that Crow has been trying to unpack the dense and detailed work of the now-deceased Russian researcher Hadibov, or Hadibov for some, since he first heard about it. And I've dug through a lot of it myself, and we've done several shows discussing those early findings. The story details a template for reality that is far from what we've been told, including a hidden history involving a spider-like race of beings that invaded our natural system thousands of years ago, their trial and error experiments in merging their spider brains with our human vessels, and the institution of a control grid and planetary management system maintained by a series of automated crafts and a moon control center. Throw in the various genotypes of humanity as well as consciousness driven by a wavelength and octave system, and you got yourself Hadibov in a nutshell. Well, way back in August, I did a show with Crow and a second guest, James Alfred of the Sage Sigma blog, who has really been breaking down the Hadibov stuff better than anybody. And he's back with us again today to talk about the latest updates. Always a good time. Happy to have them both here. Crow and James, welcome back to THC.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Hey, good to be back on.
I love it. So, all right, guys, we just had Crow here talking about his big road trip and the things he captured along the way. James, talk to us about where your research has gone with Hadibov since we last talked. It seems like it's gotten even deeper and stranger, hasn't it?
It has. It's basically been a process of continuing to break it down, and anybody familiar with the literature knows that it's kind of cobbled together, and it takes a little bit of time to piece together statements and make sense of it and put it in a summary that makes some sense to the rest of us. One of the better things, and I'm happy that you had me on initially, was that there are a couple people now that have been sending me some further research, Russian research in PDF formats, links to various theories and websites and so forth. So there's a lot more that's happening, but unfortunately I've got 40 hours a week I have to work, so it takes a little bit of time to dig through all the material and summarize it. But yeah, it's been fun. I've been getting a lot of positive feedback, and I've been getting quite a bit of documentation. Fortunately, it's all in Russian at this point, so and I'm not a native Russian speaker, so I'll get to it eventually. So it's been great.
That's awesome, man. Well, you do a great job. I check out every blog post breakdown you do, and I'm always thoroughly impressed. Now, we did do a lot of the introductory stuff last time, and I don't want to spend too much energy on the critical side. The world will do plenty of that for us, but a few points. With all the details involved in this material, if this was some rich mythology or sci-fi nonsense, I don't think it would be as dense with the math and the science. And if this was meant to be disinformation, usually those people are given a bigger platform for their ideas to catch on. This guy had almost no platform, and you're having to really stretch to get as much information as you can. You know, when you compare that to a guy like Alex Jones, who has a huge corporate funded and sanctioned network, I guess I would just say that if this guy was meant to be some type of disinformation agent, he really wasn't given the tools to be effective, you know?
Sure. You know, like we talked about initially, there's allegedly 16,500 pages of additional documentation that's out there. And when you look at what's available online, you're only looking at perhaps 300 to 400 pages of documentation. And one of the biggest problems with that material, that source material that's currently available to everybody, is there's consistent references to various appendices. Please refer to this book on cold plasma or whatever the name of the book is. And at this time, nobody seems to have that, at least not in an English format. So yeah, it's tough. You know, we're taking maybe 10% of the available material at best, and we're trying to extrapolate it, like you said, into some meaningful context, some overarching mythos.
Yeah. You know, we did talk about the actual man a little bit last time, his biography, because you have gotten a little bit enlightened on the man himself, although there are just breadcrumbs to the story. There's not a whole lot out there on him. But when it comes to demystifying the man, it seems like you've come across an interesting possibility since we last talked that he might have been some sort of Israeli intelligence double agent. Is that right?
That is right. There's an individual who I believe is from Russia originally. He's been posting some of my work and been referencing me. He's not taking credit for it, so I thank him for that. He and I got into a conversation regarding the man himself. Did he actually exist, and was this an actual scientist in the Soviet Union? He did say that this individual did exist, that his sources stated that this man did indeed exist. This material is as accurate as it currently is. There is the possibility that somebody's gone in after the fact and rewritten some of the passages and added some further lines that might be misrepresenting it. But he also went on to say that he thought that he was possibly an Israeli double agent. He was embedded in the Soviet Union, and he was more or less putting together this material with the full intent of delivering it back to the Israeli government, which would be in line with that conversation we had previous, where I believe the state of Israel received all of his information upon his death, or all of his information was taken at some point in his life. So
right.
This individual who claims to know through other resources and references that this guy existed truly believes that he was an Israeli double agent working for the KGB.
Man, that does add more fuel to the fire. And when some agency snatches up a dead researcher's work, I always think of Tesla, but this new angle could definitely explain that. Although the double agent story reminds me a bit of Crowley, one of the most renowned occult writers ever. It seems like he was an agent for the British government. I guess on some level, if you are an intelligent person who's onto something alternative, you're going to get approached and picked up to do some work for the system somewhere. Who really knows if that's how it works? But I go back and forth on if the elite really even know everything there is to know about the world and its history. I mean, sure, they mislead us, but sometimes I wonder how sure they are about things. That's why some of their agencies investigate wild ideas like this. They're almost too compartmentalized for their own good, perhaps. But Crow, let me ask you about this Israeli double agent thing. Does this help or hurt Hadibov's credibility in your eyes? Because I could see it going either way.
Well, I think in the foremost of my mind, the specificity of the work and the fact that we didn't get it all or any sizable amount of it tells us something. If this was intended to be misinformation, it seems unlikely to me that the specificity would hold together across such disparate subjects. But not only that, I mean, wouldn't we have whole pieces of the, research, not just a page here, a page there? But to top it off, some of the things that I started with that I handed off to James, a lot of those links are dead. And then to top it off, we have, Hadibov.com sprung up on the web.
Right.
So there's clearly, in my mind, a there. But, I would also add on my trip, I was up in Lake Michigan and was able to confirm a piece of the Hadibov research where he says one of the major hubs of terrestrial UFO activity is over the Great Lakes. And this is absolutely what I witnessed firsthand. So I think there is a there. I just think it's going to take time and effort from people like James and others to really dig in and find out what we can know about the man. And clearly we know he worked for oil companies, has a university that he was apparently picked up his degrees from. These are things that over time I think can vet out.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting thing. You mentioned briefly that Hadibov.com is now a website, and I don't think any of the three of us are involved in any way. But it does seem like they're linking to James's articles over and over and over again. It just seems like it's kind of like a redirect. But Hadibov.com, I feel good about that in some way. I like to see the spreading of it.
You know what's funny about that is he spelled the name, whoever put that site up, and I did a who is lookup on it. It's served from GoDaddy, but they've got the privacy on it, so you don't know who it is. But I noticed they spelled the name with the D's. And my initial gut reaction was, I wonder if this is a Russian speaker who did this. But like you mentioned, they seem to be just kind of scooping the work that James has done. So we need to keep an eye on it to see if it ends up being disinformation or something more.
Yeah, the spelling itself is an enigma. Some people use a T instead of a D, or it's a Y or an I, and on the end it's either a V or a W, and I see James's spelling has changed over time. For me, I just try to stay consistent with my own spelling at this point. The material is confusing enough. We don't really need this spelling issue out there. Although, another thing I wanted to bring up as far as disinformation goes before we get too deep, I get these type of concerns from time to time about you, Crow. Some people say, this guy came out of nowhere. He's got this lunar wave footage. He's suddenly all over the place. He's even got 777 in his name, which is almost like 666. Very sketchy. But people should know that I sought you out. You know, it's not like you were banging down my door to get on the show like I get week after week from some people, disinfo or not. But again, I had to have some preliminary talks with you. You had to vet me for yourself. And that's not really the way an agent works in my mind. But because it has come up a few times, how scary is this 777, man? What's the deal?
Yeah, you know what? And I'll state categorically for the record, and I've said this other times, when I set up my YouTube channel, that was entirely a play on my name. The numbers, the 2 R's, everything was entirely a play on my name. And at the time, I was aware of numerology and gematria, but not that into it. And not aware of it is I am actually now. And just for the record, if I had it to do over, I would just be Crow, because so many people have gotten hung up on it. And, you know, you just mentioned Crowley in this interview, and I get that all the time. As a matter of fact, I think Ground Zero may have interviewed me because they thought there was some relation to Crowley, and there isn't. I'll state it categorically. If I did it all over again, I would just be Crow. And so there's that. But as for disinformation, Agent, all anyone needs to know is the thousands of hours I have put in, and I've got the video to back it up. Someone involved in nefarious games is not going to put in the time I've put in filming the sky. I mean, it's literally thousands of hours. So there's my response.
Fair. All right, let's get to the material, because, you know, we could talk all day. But
yeah.
James, let's get down into some of the prehistory stuff, because that seems like a big chunk that you've kind of gotten a better handle on since we last talked, describing what you call the 4 different epochs. I know it can get a little confusing with all the dates and time frames, but talk to us about this prehistory part of the puzzle.
Sure. This would be all post-interventionist Ebrov creation in the solar system. So, again, as we discussed in the...
I was just going to say, yeah, the Ebrov, I think you were just going to say that. But Ebrov is the term used for the spider race in this context, right?
It is, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
It is. And again, in roughly 18,000 BC, they basically came to the solar system. At that time, the solar system did not include the solar sun, the lunar moon, and various satellites around the planets. At that time, Hadibov even goes on to say that there's actually 2 more planets in our solar system that were here originally, and that modern science and astronomy has yet to discover these 2 other planets. And so at that point in time, the Ebrov take control of our solar system by destroying Phaeton, and Phaeton was the security element of our super system prior to the spider intervention. The first epoch then was from 17,000 BC to roughly 13,000 BC. And what people have identified that as the age of the creation of the human flesh jacket. So this goes back to the idea that the spider brain exists in the human body, and at this point in time they're going to attempt to merge a lower octave brain. The Ebrov currently at this point in time exists at octave 31, and they want to synthesize that with a human flesh jacket to achieve octave 96. So the Ebrov, historically, and in these documents that I have found, was a parasitic dying civilization. They were at a lower end of the cosmic consciousness, and what they did is they took an opportunity to take control of human civilization, merge their brains with ours in order to become a member of the higher cosmic consciousness in the universe. So at that point in time, life on Earth was completely wiped out. All of the existing systems of control that were placed here prior to that were destroyed. There's really no mention as to who put that here initially, so that is a discussion for another day for further research. At this time, what is happening is they're imprisoning all of these human energies. When they annihilated planet Earth, they put them in these object types 440s. And that's kind of an interesting segment to all of this research. An object 440 is a special object in the system. It's a type 1, type 2 UFO that is plasmoid in nature. There's a really fascinating article that has quite a bit of technical detail surrounding object 440 and how it's able to change shapes, it's able to manipulate energy and so forth. But at a very high level, this object 440 has the ability to trap and sustain life energies, travel to and from the Earth to the lunar moon, and dictate behavior in this prototype life form that we're going to currently go over. So continuing with the first epoch, there's some geoengineering that takes place to accommodate the spider biology. So there's some work done on water, also on the atmosphere. The Ebrov management complexes are installed on the face of the Earth at this time in typical specificity, 4,300 meters below the current sea level. Also at this time is the first test population. So the literature is claiming that 2% of human energies that were entrapped in these object type 440s are put on the face of the Earth. This again is like a proto-human, an arachnid brain in a human flesh jacket. Curiously, humanoids at that time are 1.88 meters in height, and the spiders are 2.5 to 4 meters in height. So you can imagine this sense of like a spider god that was running around on the planet. These humanoids also carried limited metabolic processes. They had the ability to breathe the new atmosphere that the Ebrov implanted, and they can also survive this new habitat, this geoengineering that had been happening. This unfortunately ended in 13,954 BC. It's mentioned that all humanoids were ruthlessly annihilated during the course of 2 days. So the first test was an absolute failure, and the Ebrov eradicated accordingly.
Damn.
So then it goes into the second epoch. This goes from roughly 1300 BC to 10,800 BC. The new jacket at this point in time strengthened the weakness of the flesh of the spiders. There's continued geoengineering at this point in time. The Ebrov synthesized a new flora-fauna system that can flourish on this post-interventionist Earth. And what this does is it allows animals and plants to provide sustenance for the survival. For the survival of social structures. The second test population, utilized 21% of the trapped energies that were in these type 440 objects. At this point in time, this proto-human could live a longer life, 18 to 22 years. The diet could depend on the consumption of meat. And there's also some water frequency octave characteristics that are modified on planet Earth to support life at this lower octave. Again, extermination of all of these of this test population begins in the year 10,804 BC. So that concludes the second epoch.
Okay.
Third epoch goes from 10,000 BC to roughly 6,000 BC. More or less, more of the same. You have geoengineering. You have some changes to the biological operating system of these humanoids. There is an energy grid that is placed on the surface of this Earth using 8.64 million, I believe, power poles of energy grids, and this could potentially be a ley line type situation. Again, it's mentioned in a couple parts in the literature, but it's tough to make sense of what exactly it is. But you can kind of think of that as like a magnetic ley line situation being put on the Earth. It's at this point in time that there's the Great Flood, and at that time the Ebrov land management system dumps 1,500 meters of rain onto the planet. This did three things. It transformed the surface of the Earth as we know it today. It created bodies of salt water, which would be the oceans and so forth. And it removed the evidence of human experimentation up until that point. Again, the arachnid brain and the human synthesis is not completely successful. Extermination of all beings again occurs in the year 6234 BC.
Wow. 6234 BC.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's basically 16,000 years of experimentation that went wrong.
Damn. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it seems like that's what each epoch is. It's just a test, and then they're like, okay, and maybe each time they learn a little bit from their previous tests, get a little more refined, and update their process. But, okay, talk to us about that fourth epoch.
Yeah, this was the important one, and in typical fashion, there's a specific date, September 3761 BC. This is the first time that the human body is successfully implemented by the Ebrov to synthesize the arachnid brain. This provided the basis of the statement, the image and likeness of God that's in legends, the myths, and the Bible, and so forth. There's also, at this point in time, tents that begin to show up. A tent in the Hadibov material is defined as a clump or a cluster of people that share a common language, common values, and experience common conditions in the environment. The object 440s are now utilized to assist in human definitions of shelter, food, and safe recreation. The 440s also assist in the development of logical critical thought and the ability to send and receive information through conscious speech. One interesting note here is that despite the fact that they had intended to use this flood in the prior epoch to get rid of it, all of this testing failed prior to this point in time, and that there's skeletons of various horrific creatures and evidence of their experiments that are still found around the globe.
Dinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly. And all those weird mutated skeletons that occasionally pop up, giants and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. That would explain the giants thing.
Yes, and the last key piece to this is the idea of the Mayan civilization. This was an experimental test population that was utilized to experiment with the idea of mantisas, or mantisas. I'm probably butchering that, but you can think of a mantisa as like a effectivity or a version of a genotype. And so at this point in time, through the control complexes of the Andes Mountains, this baseline genotype is utilizing some sort of experimentation where they can create improved versions of that genotype over the course of time. So that wraps up that first 4 prehistory period of the Hadibov material.
Yeah, man, that is so interesting. And I think the real value of this is hearing it and weighing it against other ideas that have been out there in the alternative community already. Because you could almost say Ebrov is the Russian translation for Archon. I mean, this sounds like the story of how the Archons could have taken control. It also sounds like, I mean, Ancient Aliens is huge and popular, but there aren't a lot of details to the context of how we were genetically engineered. I mean, that's what this sounds like. I just think that it's great. It's kind of the details of the Gnostic story of Archon control.
Exactly. And it's interesting that it was a linear algebra geo-mining engineer that's the individual who cracked this in the mid-'80s. It's kind of an interesting idea to the whole concept of Gnostic materiality and the Archons, as you had mentioned before.
Yeah.
Cracked in 1985, yeah.
That is a great point, too. And to reiterate, how did he come across this information? How does the story go?
The story that I've been able to piece together is that when he was working for an oil institute in Samara in the mid-'80s, I believe he was utilizing a supercomputer that was more or less utilized to figure out depths of mining, the kind of minerals that are below the surface of the earth and that. I'm not a mining engineer, so I couldn't speak to the technology, but at some point in time, he went on strike. He wasn't being paid a fair wage for his work, and he utilized this computer while he had some downtime, more or less. And it's at that point in time he cracked the land Ebrov management system. So that's the origin of how Hadibov more or less discovered this overriding reality and software program that's running our reality on this planet.
Yeah, man, it is amazing. Also, I just interviewed Linda Moulton Howell not long ago, and her big thing that she's talking about now is self-activating software and hardware in the UFO field. The idea of crafts that are not piloted by someone, but are just on autopilot from some type of system. And I'm like, again, you need to look at Hadibov, woman.
Yeah.
It touches on so many different things. You mentioned the Object 440s. Crow, when you hear that description of what an Object 440 is, this vessel that is a plasmonoid in nature and can actually trap life energies and shape shifts, of the things you've captured, do you feel like there's anything that you've seen that would fit that description?
Well, I mean, even if we look at the orbs that have been around chemtrails, there's a lot of people trying to claim or demonstrate in some way that those are plasmoid or plasma in some way. And to be honest with you, of all the things I have filmed, the hardest one to explain is that orb that's shooting what appears to be a couple plasma bursts into a chemtrail, clearly free-flying. But from the Hadibov material, I think there's a couple important things that you guys mentioned. The kind of easily bridged idea that it matches the Archon's mythos or story or whatever we would call it from the Gnostic sector. But for me personally, you see so much of this subtextually encoded into the Hollywood stuff that we're presented with. And, having just mentioned all the kind of biblical crossover that James was hinting towards, even the movie Noah had the multi-armed beings that were, from heaven, for lack of a better, description. But what is being described here is absolutely being encoded into Hollywood movies where there's this multi-armed being that has the ability to go inside of a human, and then the Gnostic crossovers. But I drifted a little bit there. To be short and concise, the shooting orb, I think, is kind of a prime example of what you asked me. Yeah, it looks to be plasma, and it's a very difficult thing to describe.
You got to find something about that interesting. I mean, people are seeing these orbs. The debate is always, are they intelligently controlled? Are they intelligence itself? Is it some type of disembodied consciousness? These are all strange questions that you have to ask when you see some of those pictures of those orbs and you try to identify what it could be.
There's actually no doubt, and I stated it at the time, either those orbs are conscious or consciously controlled. There's no debate in my mind. You can see it going against the wind, you can see it steering, and then you see it pump off a couple of, plasma guns or something.
Yeah.
So there it is.
Right on. So I do love that saga right there. I love having the whole story rolled out in a clear and concise fashion. But another element to this is the genotypes. And you have, James, made some advancements on understanding that, from what I understand, the various versions of levels of consciousness within humanity. It's interesting. This is some of my favorite stuff. But what's new in this area, or what kind of new details can you give us about this sector?
As far as new details, I've been able to more or less map out the progression of the genotype through 1605 BC all the way through 1990 AD. And just so people get an idea, genotypes isn't necessarily your standard scientific definition. As Hadibov would describe it, the genotype is attached to the brain, and it's more or less in unique correspondence with a corresponding control complex of the land management system. So when you start to look at the various genotypes, there's always a pyramid, or what would be called a sand-covered pyramid, which more or less is a mountain that is linked to each unique genotype. And then from being able to control the brain then controls every living cell in the human body. And you have more or less a way to manage different population sets on the planet. I wanted to point out three big things as far as why I think that the genotypes are needed, and from what I can gather from the research. One, again, is just to control the biostructure of the human brain and dictate human behavior. Also, throughout the course of Ebrov genotype evolution, there's consistently raising of that octave. Again, the original octave of the arachnid brain was at 31 and the human brain 96, so there was this idea that over the course of time they were elevating the brain of the arachnid to this higher cosmic consciousness octave. And then also at the same time, what you see throughout the literature is kind of an economic, socioeconomic underlying paradigm where there's a consolidation of resources. So what appears to be happening is that through the use of genotypes, not only are you getting an improved biological humanoid, but you're also consolidating wealth, power through legitimized religion, state control, and so forth. So there's a very interesting socioeconomic parallel that fits with the genotype description.
Yeah, man, that is interesting, and it kind of jives with the religious notion of a fall from heaven in the ancient past. If you consider heaven to be a higher form of consciousness, and these spider beings, in their attempt to raise their own consciousness, have to lower the vibration of humanity to sort of make it compatible and meet in the middle, and there you have this devolution concept. But walk us through the various genotypes that they worked on. Apparently, the first version is called the speaking people because really we're talking about the evolution of man, but from this weird genetic engineering perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, and that is at the end of that fourth epoch. So in 1605, again, when they created this idea of a successful synthesis of the arachnid brain with the human body, they rolled that out in genotype 421. The control center of that was Mount Ararat, and there was a specific geographical area that this population subset belonged to. There's talk that these an establishment of morals on the family unit. It allowed for humans to more or less migrate away from these Object 440 controlled human tents, these areas or these encampments of social communities. There's a big emphasis to begin social order construction and units of social organization. And some of the other secondary literature, there's talk that at this point in time, you're beginning to establish financial equivalencies for services and goods. So at this point in time, there's a human awakeness towards the benefit of employing economic means to consolidate gains, or at least put a system in place that can be manipulated down the road and consolidated. So that all happens with this genotype 421. And in each genotype, I should say, there's, I think, 12 effectivity. So when you move up to genotype 422, which is in 822 BC, between 1605 BC and 822 BC, there could be some combination of 12 improvements to these biological jackets over the course of that time.
Right. Like mini updates.
Yeah, like mini updates. Yep. And again, it's basically just continued improvements to the biological jacket. Again, the idea that is going to eventually end at the top is that this Ebrov is basically trying to figure out human death and an avoidance of the human death so that these brains can have eternal life. So that's where all of these genotype progressions are moving towards.
Gotcha.
In 822 BC, the Ebrov would have allegedly rolled out genotype 422. The control center of that was Mount Kazbek, and that was the era of pig selfishness, the idea of people gods. It was at this point in time in history that the elite legitimized the elite's needs and desires over the rest of the population. This group of people began to see superiority over other groups of people and over nature. So there's this conflict that's beginning to be introduced. And at that time, this was an ideal group for the people gods, but unfortunately the bodies and the brains died too quickly. So they had basically figured out a way to be atop the social pyramid, but the bodies were dying too soon. So that rolls into the genotype 423.
Mm-hmm.
And again, in Hadibov fashion, as of January 17th, 12:07 a.m. on 0 AD, 423 was rolled out utilizing the reincarnation program and the Christ program. And maybe talk about that now or a little bit later, but reincarnation is a program that allows the Ebrov brain to have sustained life. So upon the death of the jacket, the Ebrov is moved to a different complex, it's archived, and then it's reinserted into a jacket. So this was the time period that they figured out a way to have eternal life by recycling the brain through various flesh jackets.
Nice. Yeah, that is super interesting. And it's also fascinating that it is year zero, because me and Crow and some other shows have talked about the manipulation of history and how we know that the years of history, this isn't literally the beginning. You would think year zero would be the beginning of history, but it really is just some date thrown in there from the Roman Catholic Church. It says this is where we're now going to, everything before this, who gives a shit? Now that we're established, we're going to start counting history.
Yeah.
And we still, 2,000 years later, use that paradigm. But in this context, it's interesting that that is when they discovered reincarnation, year zero. So that's where they put the marker for history. And there's more details there. We will come back to it, but walk us through the progression of the genotypes.
Sure. At when's 423, it's this idea that Christ is rolled out. So now at this time, they're legitimizing the idea of reincarnation, and they're also using it as a form of control over the masses. Everything seems to be fine until 1433 AD. At that point in time, the Ebrov land management system dictates the formation of the Golden Billion. That begins with genotype 441. Its control center or control complex is Mount Blanc. This genotype begins to use the power of money and the power of the state to create control over the masses. It's also referenced at this time that it's the birth of ideas of secret societies. This is a subgroup of people at this point in time that have the sense of being special and having an ability to bypass existing norms and laws that the rest of us would have had to deal with at that time. It's the idea that people that have this genotype can sense that they're attached to the land management system, that there's something special about them. And that's ultimately what's going to create this elite concept that they're better than everybody else, therefore they have the right to the resources, wealth, and social control. This one apparently ended in 1871 AD. There was too much infighting in this group, so there was an upgrade at that point in time to genotype 442. That control complex was the Alps 2 mountain. I haven't been able to do a full post on this, but I plan to do it in the future. But through the manipulation of three periods of time, there's the revolutionary period, militant fascism, and destructive democracy. This runs from 1871 through 1990 AD. And the purpose of all these wars that we witnessed in the 20th century, late 19th century, was to reduce the population, people that were expendable, the waste products, you and me and whoever else that aren't part of that Golden Billion genotype subset. And it's basically consolidating the wealth and resources to the Golden Billion. So it's through the use of various wars that the Ebrov are beginning the consolidation of economic power.
So can I interject a question here? Is there a direct relationship between the Golden Billion and the sun?
Well, the Golden Billion, that is a good question. The sun is key to the idea of reincarnation and the adjustment of matrices. So this gets into the idea of the matrix brain. People that are in this Golden Billion, Golden Million subset of the population, they're attached to the matrix. And whenever there needs to be a sense of enlightenment or technological improvement, scientific progress or whatnot. It's what the research is showing is that there's a movement of information from one of the planetary satellites to Earth, the complex Ethiopia. Ethiopia then routes it to Kailash. Kailash uploads it to the moon. The moon at that point in time basically resets all of the brain matrices on the planet Earth that belong in this genotype population group. And then there's communication. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, which is the download where you and I began to talk about, the lunar wave as possibly being visibly the download that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a communication that's to the sun. And at that point, the sun is the start to the upload or to the upgrade to the brain matrix. So the sun is basically at that point in time sending out a magnetic pulse. And that after the moon has reset and downloaded this information to this group, kind of prepared this population set, the sun sending a magnetic pulse basically adjusts the Ebrov land management system, and now you've got this upload or this updated brain that's in the genotype 441 golden billion.
And we also talked a little bit about the Hadibov description of Jewishness in relation to exactly what we're talking about. And to be clear, we're not calling Jewishness like a gene type, like their DNA, could be recognized as Jewish. But is there a direct reference in the Hadibov material about Jewishness and the golden billion in relation to the sun in the way you just described?
There is, and like we talked, there's a possibility that somebody went in afterwards, but it does definitely spell out that, there is a group of Jewishness. They're not necessarily, it's not the genetic makeup, but they just happen to be categorized as having Jewish.
It's a level of awakening, I think, is how it's described, right?
Yes. Yeah. Enlightenment, exactly. It's all created through this process of satellites, controlled complexes on Earth and the moon and the sun, yeah.
This is so interesting. So it's like as the process was more refined and these Ebrov were more able to hook into the human mind and body, it seems like the minds kind of melded a little bit more to the degree that with this golden billion, they could now sense the control system around them. They could kind of sense what's going on, getting a piece that reality isn't exactly what they think. And this in turn forms secret societies, forms an elite that acts more as a puppet master or a liaison between the two in some sense. And yeah, I think that's super fascinating. Is there more to say about the line of the genotypes?
There is one more, and this gets into confusion. Crrow and I were talking about this recently. There was a formation of genotype 461, which was to be the golden million genotype. It talks about that control complex being in Mount Kailash, California, which I think is Mount Shasta, which would be interesting given kind of all of the mystery that surrounds Mount Shasta.
Yeah.
This genotype, at this point, this is where the Ebrov had figured out how to create an eternal life of the brain through the eternal life of the jacket. So reincarnation is no longer needed. At the beginning of this genotype, you have improved biological characteristics of the elite. The literature then goes on to state that in 2012, there was to be a download of 1.2 million children of the sun to Earth. And I think what that is saying, and Crrow, correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the sense that possibly did not happen, and the golden million wasn't fully formulated, but Crrow's got some ideas on that.
It sounds like Hadibov, actually, there are people out there who speak of him literally as being a savior to the humankind, blocked that download. That's what we're talking about, right, James?
Yes, yep.
Okay, so Hadibov somehow intervenes and blocks a download of what James and I have been calling Children of the Sun. The reason we call it that is because of the old Billy Thorpe song, Children of the Sun. We're just using it as a terminology, and the song is interesting too. But there was this download coming from the sun, which is interesting on so many levels, and you and I have talked about the secret societies are basically tracking and encoding with Hollywood the movement of the sun, which probably plays into the idea we're talking about. But somehow Hadibov comes along and he blocks this download, and it's viewed as like saving humanity as a whole. And the reason I find this interesting, not just because we know that the secret societies are encoding the path of the sun, that Hollywood is doing it, that the Vatican is doing it, there seems to be evidence of two groups at odds down here. And it looks to me like the spiders are related to Jewishness, and this whole idea and the things we can see about spiders is absolutely related to the music industry in Hollywood. That's where we see it. By the same token, we see this kind of Bohemian Grove group where they're stating they seem to be represented by the owl, and they even on a plaque have weaving spiders come not here. But why that's interesting is we see these two kind of groups in some ways at odds. As an example, the kid who played Eric Foreman on the 70s show showed up in a movie wearing a shirt saying owls are assholes. And then by the flip side of that coin, we see so much spider talk in the music industry, like No Doubt, Walking in the Spider Web, Joan Osborne. There's a whole song about Ray Charles and the spider webs in his head. I know I've kind of tracked off a bit. So I guess the main point that I was going to make there was that the sun is related to the golden million or billion, which seems to be related to Jewishness, which is absolutely related to the arachnid brain and being reflected in the Jewish-controlled music and movie industry.
Man, I think those are pretty interesting connections. I really love the Bohemian Grove stuff. I think that always intrigued me why the phrase would be weaving spiders come not here. It always seemed a little paranormal in a sense. One weird thing is that this golden million, this last update, so we have the update right before the last one where they uncover reincarnation and they can keep their mind going with various human meat bodies. And now they have this update apparently in 1990 where they've got this new way to just keep the body going forever. That's really interesting. And I guess if it is so late in the game that this happened, we wouldn't see indications quite yet of there being people that look like they've been in the public eye way, way too long.
I'm sorry, let me interject. But couldn't this relate directly to this kind of death by the numbers game we see, right? So if we were going to theorize, and this is absolutely theorizing, that we know for a fact that a lot of famous people die by the numbers. And some people hold that they're being sacrificed, which I don't buy for a second. But there's actually a movie out there, an old British movie, and if anyone listening knows the name of this movie, I'd love to know it. I've been looking for it, where famous people die on a certain date. They go literally underground to this very plush city. They live there for a couple years till everyone's forgot about them. Then they reemerge under a new identity, and they continue on. But I think this idea that death for this elite group that we see in entertainment, in maybe public office, government, and royalty, we see them dying by the numbers. And I have, for the longest time, looked at this and thought there's something very strange about this. And I think it may relate directly if there's any basis to what we're talking about.
Yeah, totally could be. I also kind of thought, what happened in the 90s, in terms of the human mind and body. And there was a lot of people talking about DNA activation, and indigo kids was this term that got thrown around a lot. The kids born in the 90s seemed to have a higher consciousness and behaved a little differently in social situations. They were just a little bit different. And I was wondering if perhaps that could tie in somehow. I
can take a crack at that. So we know that these things are true. We know that there has been some kind of a change. What we don't know is it just because the internet's here, so now we're more aware of it because we can talk to someone in China we never would have met previously? We don't know that. But what we do know is we see human beings, particularly after the last 2-3 years, becoming way more aware. And we see children with abilities that far surpass the abilities of their parents. This is not speculation. This is a thing that we can know and witness in our own time. We don't have to read about it. We can see it. So there is something going on there. The problem is we just don't have a way to correlate it, though clearly when the media was hyping up 2012 and, kind of making it this big scary, the world's going to end, but there's a upgrade for humans and all this alignment of galaxies and this other hokum that got pushed by the mainstream. I think a more accurate date is 2009, having been online, where we actually do see people becoming less satisfied with all these systems that we'd lived with for so long and begin to question them and begin to realize that, hey, man, something's not right here, and we're going to begin to question it more. And in my mind, that is people kind of getting a consciousness upgrade.
And another interesting thing about the 2000s is there is a little anecdote in here that, James, maybe you can relay to us about the selling of the flesh bodies. As these Ebrov found out they no longer need the reincarnation program, they can stick with one meat suit. They apparently started selling their older version.
Yeah, exactly. It's in an interesting discussion. I believe it's filed under Hadibov's. In all of his papers, it typically falls into a category, whether it be science or the cosmos, and this one falls into the humor section. And when you read his humor pieces, you get the sense he's just using kind of a interesting storytell to basically explain the reality of the situation. So in this one, it's called The Sale of Shirts, and it's the idea that in 2006 AD, there was an invite only to the Golden Billion, where individuals of the Golden Billion could come in and they could basically purchase a flesh suit and use reincarnation. So you kind of get the sense that possibly the land management system was going to cut off reincarnation going forward, because the Golden Million would ultimately be the ones on top of the pyramid and have all the wealth in that. So they're allowing this other genotype to basically buy a flesh suit and have access to reincarnation for $1.5 million US. And he even goes so far as to say that you could use a MasterCard to make that purchase.
Billion.
1.5 billion. Yes, sorry, 1.5 billion US dollars. And so at that time, it says that if you make this purchase, you can live at the expense of all those that are not wearing shirts. Again, that implies that the rest of us are just kind of here for maintenance for the elites. And there's an opportunity for the brain to survive human death going forward. But it also says that if the day after you bought this shirt and you didn't make proper payment, your brain and your flesh suit was immediately destroyed. And if you were to have any problems communicating with God, again, this flesh jacket has this, what he calls a cell phone with a direct link to God. You could refer to this manual called How to Communicate with God by I.N. Yanitsky. So it seems to be something further to research. I did Google that phrase and that author, and I didn't come up with a whole lot. So again, if anybody's got that, I'd love to read it. And if they want to send it over,
There's another funny thing to consider here too. When you look at, like, say, false flags and all the false news that we see, and then we now know this has been going on for generations, someone might ask, say back in the 50s, why would these people have put so much of their life into these false events to shape some eventuality that would seemingly come around long after they're dead? It's always puzzled me. The amount of effort and resources and everything else that has gone into this. And we can see events as far back in history as we can look. We can look past the Titanic. We can look through World War II. We can even look through World War I and see that there were false flags, false events that took a lot of effort to pull off, in the same way Paris was recently for us. And it's always puzzled me. Why would the old men of that age have put so much of their life into doing that when the outcome was going to, it's not here yet.
Right.
So it's a thing to consider.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest criticisms of conspiracy culture is these multi-generational plans by the Rothschilds and Rockefellers. Some people don't put stock in that idea because, ultimately when you're dead, who cares? Why are your kids going to carry on your plan also? I mean, this kind of answers some of those questions, but also to talk about, Crow, your hypothesis that some of these people who die in the mainstream don't really die. If we're talking about 2007 being the time that these meat jackets started to go on sale for people of extreme wealth, Michael Jackson died apparently 2 years later in 2009. His last tour was called This Is It, and the album that came out after his death was called Immortal.
There you go. And it's not the only reference. I mean, you can look, even if we set aside the Hadibov material and said someday, okay, none of this was correct. If you were rich enough on this planet and had access to actual real medicine and actual real unadulterated food and water, you would be able to go a lot longer. But the truth is, we can see, you just pointed it out, there is an encoding. You can go back to any number of songs and hear them talking about lifespans that seemingly shouldn't be logically talked about. You know, the band from Australia, what was it called? The big band from the 80s has the song, "We Can Live for 1,000 Years. And if I hurt you, I'll make wine from your tears. I told you we can fly because we all have wings, but some of us don't know why." There's an endless litany of these lyrics in these movies that seem to demonstrate this reference to a lifetime that just continues to go on or lives up to about 1,000 years, which is ironic because in the Bible, I think Methuselah is the oldest guy and he's right there at about the 1,000-year mark. But clearly, we can see these famous people dying by the numbers. We can see things like Family Guy echoing the deaths before they happen. There's something going on there. And for my money, these people are living longer than we are. I just don't know how they're pulling it off.
Yeah, man, I'm not sure. But I am curious if maybe the Egyptians ever came up in this material, because they did have some odd funeral rites and some weird thoughts about the afterlife. Have you noticed anything in there about the Egyptians, James?
Nothing unique. There was an article, or I should say a reference to a civilization in North Africa that was destroyed by the land management system. There isn't an exact date to it, but that was the idea that UFOs were utilized to basically terraform northern Africa. For whatever reason, the Ebrov weren't happy with that civilization's progress. So there was complete eradication of that. But it doesn't specifically say it's Egypt. I could only guess northern Africa, or maybe it was something in the Sahara, which is now a desert. But nothing unique to Egypt, no.
Right on. Let me also ask you this, because you mentioned to me that motivations for the BP oil spill seem to be related to an agenda to liquidate the golden billion, perhaps. Yeah. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, that goes back to Crrow's comment about the owls, that there's potentially two conflicting groups of people on this planet. The British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, basically was talking about the fact that BP management dictated that happened. So they had this oil spill that came out of the bottom of the ocean. Ahead of time, they could utilize the current, the Gulf Stream, and so forth. And what that did was it allowed this waterway to go across the globe and more or less kind of mix up the matrix, or this connection between the golden billion and the land management system. And it was interesting that it pointed out that it was intentional. It was done by BP executives, or BP senior management. I don't know what you would call it. But that would seem to indicate that there are potentially at least two groups of elite that are currently at odds with one another, and there's possibly this war that's going on kind of underneath the media.
And not only that, this could tie into chemtrails as well, because before I realized I was going to have to move, I was starting to get into research where people had tracked that these old UPS planes were being outfitted for spraying under the guise of emergency response teams for oil spills. Now, for the first time at the BP oil spill, we saw these kind of big jetliners coming in to spray what we were told was oil dispersant or clumping. I forget what it was. It was either to disperse or clump the oil, but they were spraying it over this supposed oil spill. And then after the fact, here years later, we see these planes being outfitted, which is ludicrous on the face of it, because any given oil spill, how many massive jetliners would you need to spray an area like that? And yet they are actively taking old fleet planes from places like FedEx or Southwest, I believe, and some people have tracked to show them get converted into these aerial aerosol spraying units and then painted on the side with emergency oil spill response. So when we look at these chemtrails, if anything about the hypothesis on the BP oil spill is true, I mean, you wonder, this chemtrailing is going on. We're talking about downloads from the moon. We're talking about energy matrices and all this stuff. Could chemtrails be, in fact, one group trying to prevent another from succeeding at something? Could that be part of what chemtrails is about?
Ah, that is possible. Yeah, I'm curious if there are other areas where you guys see this conflict bubbling up to the surface, because you got to assume that it's largely under the radar, but something like the BP oil spill or chemtrails, sometimes they can't hide their attacks on the other group. If this were to be the paradigm that we're involved with, are there other areas where you see the conflict bubbling up?
There's also talk, personally, and I let Crrow know about this too, I've started to kind of look into the idea of the deep state and the group of people that more or less run this the globe, and how that there's always this conflict. So interesting hypothesis was that this most recent S&P crash, I think it was like a point and a half, and everybody panicked. That was basically one group of the elites warring with another one and making a point, letting them know that, hey, you're doing something that we don't approve of, so we're going to wipe you out in a single day, whatever it is. And it's interesting that, me and my wife and whoever else's 401k, you sit there and you worry about your future in 30 to 40 years. And for these people, it's nothing. They just completely will manipulate the markets. They manipulate the S&P 500, global currencies, so forth. And it's just it's a game for them. They're basically, when they're coming into conflict with one another, they're utilizing the power to basically move markets, and they're basically just pinging each other, dinging each other. Yeah.
You've got to consider too that what we see is you hear so many people refer to the elites as being psychopathic, and almost anyone you meet on the street and talk to about this doesn't understand how someone could have that mindset, and they almost always say, I could never be that way. As I say this, I know this is true of myself. So consider a group of elites that is vying for power, and yet all of them are kind of psychopathic in this way, where they play chess with the population in the way James just described as one example. Would you want to be in a world where they've kind of boiled it down to this group of psychopathic people all vying for power? And then to top it off, to consider that there are at least one other group, if not two other groups, that are clearly conflicting with each other. In this context, we've kind of said the owls and the spiders, but, think about like the CIA or some of the military wings who clearly have global reach and all this military power. If I had to estimate, it seems like if there's anything to this Ebrov system, it doesn't look like they have a clear shot at the goal. And there's even the story of Hadibov supposedly intervening in 2006 and, by the words of some of his fans, saying he saved the human race.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. So this guy is doing oil work, deep depth work below the earth. He discovers one of these complexes. He unravels this whole land management system and this whole alien context, and then he decides to do something about it, I guess. He finds out how it works like clockwork. He interrupts the program and interrupts the download. I think that's interesting. And then what year did Hadibov die? And I mean, there is some speculation now, I've heard you talk about, that there was foul play involved in his death.
Yeah, there were two dates. Sure, I grabbed the right one. I think it was 2009, 2011. It doesn't spell out specifically that he was assassinated or murdered, but it did say that Hadibov did leave this life in a similar fashion to I believe his name is Nikolai Levashov, and he seems to be sort of a radical philosopher that was murdered also in like 2011, 2012, I think. So it doesn't directly state that he was murdered, but it's saying he left this planet in a similar fashion as this other individual who was indeed murdered. So yeah, it goes into this idea that he was running a interference program, and that's one that I need to get out too before I get done with all this Hadibov stuff. But there is a timeline out there, and it's hard for me to vet it because it kind of goes back into the secondary material. But it seems like in the late 80s there were 3 earthquakes that triggered the beginning of this interference process. And at the time, I don't recall off the top of my head where those earthquakes allegedly happened, but I looked it up on a geographical, I don't know if it was the North American Oceanic Group or whatever, some sort of a government site that listed and had a database of all these major earthquakes over the last 100 years, and those 3 weren't uniquely identified. So the paper does talk about some earthquakes that had happened and some massive tragedies, but that was ultimately him starting this interference program and him slowly more or less deassembling the land management system of the Ebrov.
It's intense.
Exactly.
Man, I think it's fascinating. I guess it's about the end of the road here. James, is there anything you can say about the future of your research or where you're going to be going with the things you're looking into?
Yeah, I'd like to conclude the Hadibov stuff, or at least, put a overlining ending to the story arc. There's still work that could be done with earthquakes, with octaves, of course, and a couple of other things out there that I'd like to get written up. And then I kind of would like to keep up with some of this fringe Russian research that's going on. I was debating on maybe potentially having some dialogues and some correspondence with some of these researchers that I've been put in contact. It's interesting that it's coming from Eastern Europe and Russia, where I don't know if it's them being ethnocentric to Russia, but everything is always put in the perspective of the Soviet Union, Russia being the motherland, and civilization starting there. So I'd like to expand and keep on talking to people, translating their work, and then getting it out for English reader consumption.
Nice. That's definitely interesting. Crow, anything to add, anything to update about your plans?
I'm going to be over on the East Coast, and then shortly thereafter, I'll be launching Crrow777 Radio, which is going to be a podcast. We've kind of hit a brick wall on YouTube where censorship and kind of how things are operating are really hampering the ability to talk about things that matter. And in building this kind of website and podcast, I'm going to create a closer, more intimate community where I am way more available to people, and to have a conversation that is made up of people who actually care, free of the kind of troll system that we see on YouTube.
Yeah, that's key, man. I'm going through the same process myself of layers of communication. But it is what it is. Well, guys, awesome. I definitely loved this. I always enjoy a good Hadibov show and ideas that are just weirder than even the weirdest of the alternative community. We all know Crrow's YouTube channel is Crrow, Crrow777. James, would you like to give the people your website and any contact info before we wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. It's www.sagesigma.blogspot.com. And then I have a handle on Twitter, Sage Sigma. And then I also have email, again, at sagesigma@gmail.com. So, yeah, I'd love to hear from people.
Very cool. Thanks again, guys. Enjoy your days.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, people, that's a wrap. I hope everybody is still kind of into hearing about this guy's work. I really thought the genotype portions and the flesh jacket and how this work describes secret societies and the elite was worth spending some time on. I always have fun speculating with those guys, but I do want to swing back into some shows with real historic or practical information. But I think there's some room for one of these out there speculative shows every once in a while. So, of course, in the first hour, we talked about the 4 epochs of the Ebrov, the Flesh Jacket, Object 440s, and the Golden Billion. And in the second hour, for the Plus members, we got into the Christ program, the Karma program, the Concave Earth researcher Sasha that James has been in contact with, more implications for secret societies, how this relates to Wayne Bush's Tricked by the Light material and Harold Kautzvela's Black Goo paradigm, and a lot more about the moon and how it's described in this work. And of course, Crrow's plea for everyone to please film Venus passing behind the moon in the daytime on December 7th. That is tomorrow from when I'm putting this show up. We want to see if we can poke another hole in the paradigm or not. So be a part of it. And of course, sign up for THC Plus. Come join the forums, give us an introduction. I respond to everyone on there, and go down some rabbit holes. You can also contribute to the Carlwood Q&A, ask me a question, and I'm going to be answering them in a bonus show in the next week or so for the Plus people. It's $5 a month. Just go to the HigherSideChatsPlus.com if you don't already. Also, I got some more of the Higher Side Chats grinders in. I know not everybody needs an herb grinder, but damn it, these are awesome. The engravings are cool, it's nice and sharp, it's stood up to my daily chronic use for close to a year now, and it's my favorite piece of THC merch. It's really all there is outside of the t-shirts. And there are also some new conspiracies. One with the latest THC logo. Also the faked moon landing shirt that looks like a crumpled up Polaroid. I really like that one. Probably a favorite of mine. And then there's one that has art expressing how the hidden hand has used the 3 major religions as a weapon. Christmas is coming, people. Support the show you love and make the weirdos in your life feel like you really get them. It's a 2 birds with 1 stone scenario. These are all printed on demand by a new company that so far has done a great job. If anyone's not happy for any reason, let me know. They have great customer service, but so far so good. And I'm going to close this one out with a song from my man Marty Leeds. I'm sure you all remember him. If you like it, you gotta track him down for it. But this is Great Pains in the Great Plains. That is it for me today. I'll catch you on the Plus forums. Your move, Ebrov operators of the land management system. Your freaking
I've been missing that Mississippi mud, the Midwestern sun, and that drop dead heat. The green fields and all the rolling hills hills, oh baby, won't you take me home? I've been hearing my heartstrings a rattle. I'm back in the saddle and I'm ready to ride. The dirty water's been calling me, darling. Oh baby, won't you take me home? I've been gone for 5 years and it's feeling like a lifetime. I made me a new home, but it ain't where my heart resides. I had me some rivers to cross, I had me mountains to climb. And there were lessons to learn to make me stronger when I return. And sure they hurt, girl, but they're meant to hurt sometimes. And I've been missing that Mississippi mud, the Midwestern sun, and that drop dead heat, the green fields and all the rolling hills. Oh baby, won't you take me home? I've been hearing my heartstrings a rattle. I'm back in the saddle and I'm ready to ride. The dirty water's been calling me, darling. Oh baby, won't you take me home? I got a few friends I miss and some that need an apology. I'm holding my bloodline and the last chance for my family. I need me some bitter winter cold. I need me 20 inches of snow. And there'll be times when I miss the coast, but honey, I know we made the most. I'll raise a toast to when we are heading on our own. I've been missing the Mississippi mud, the Midwestern sun, and that drop dead heat, the green fields and all the rolling hills. Oh baby, won't you take me home? I've been hearing my heartstrings a rattle. I'm back in the saddle and I'm ready to ride. The dirty water's been calling me, darling. Oh baby, won't you take me home? I've been missing that Mississippi mud, the Midwestern sun, and that drop dead heat, the green fields and all the rolling hills. Oh baby, won't you take me home? I've been hearing my heartstrings rattle. I'm back in the saddle and I'm ready to ride. That dirty water's been calling me, darling. Oh baby, won't you take me home?